I paid for all my father's medical bills and groceries. Until one day he yelled, "You're a disgrace. You embarrass me in front of the whole family." I stood up, handed him the bills, and walked out without a word. I, 34 am, never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd walk away from family. Growing up, my father drilled into me that family was everything, that blood was thicker than water, that you showed up no matter what. So when his diabetes got worse 3 years ago and the medical bills started piling up, I didn't hesitate. I paid them. All of them. The insulin, the specialist appointments, the emergency room visits when his blood sugar crashed at 2 in the morning. I covered his groceries too, made sure he had the diabetic-friendly food he needed, the medications that insurance wouldn't touch. My wife wasn't thrilled about it. She'd sit at our kitchen table, looking at our bank statements with this tight expression on her face, and she'd remind me that we had our own kids to think about, our own future to plan. But what was I supposed to do? Let my father struggle? Let him ration his insulin or skip meals? I told her we'd figure it out. That family came first, and she'd sigh and nod, and we'd move on. We always moved on. The thing is, my father never once said thank you. Not once in 3 years. He'd call me when he needed something, his voice gruff and demanding, telling me his prescription was ready or that he was out of milk or bread. I'd drop everything, drive across town to his house, deliver whatever he needed. Sometimes I'd stay and help him around the house, fix a leaky faucet or mow the lawn because he couldn't do it anymore. He'd watch me work and point out everything I was doing wrong, like I was still 12 years old and couldn't hammer a nail straight. My siblings never helped. My older brother lived 2 hours away and claimed he was too busy with work. My younger sister had her own family drama, always some crisis that meant she couldn't possibly contribute. So it all fell on me. The responsible one, the dependable one, the one who showed up. Last Sunday was my daughter's birthday. She turned 7, and we'd planned this whole party at our house. Bouncy castle, face painting, the works. My wife had been preparing for weeks, and our daughter was so excited she could barely sleep the night before. I'd invited my father, of course. I always invited him to family events, even though he rarely came, and when he did, he usually found something to complain about. He showed up an hour early, before any of the other guests arrived. I was in the backyard helping set up the bouncy castle when I heard his car pull into the driveway. My wife went to greet him, and I could hear her trying to make polite conversation through the open window. He brushed past her without much acknowledgement and found me outside. He wanted to talk about money. Right there, with my daughter running around in her birthday dress, with streamers hanging from the trees and a table full of presents waiting to be opened, he wanted to talk about money. He'd received a bill from his cardiologist, something about a consultation that insurance had denied, and he needed me to pay it. $800. He didn't ask. He informed me. He expected me to handle it like I handled everything else. I told him I'd look at it later, that today was about my daughter. He got this look on his face, like I'd just told him to go to hell. He said it couldn't wait, that the bill was overdue, that they were threatening to send it to collections. I repeated that we'd deal with it after the party. My wife appeared at the back door, gave me a warning look, and I knew she could sense the tension building. The party started. Kids arrived, presents piled up, and my daughter was having the time of her life. My father sat in a lawn chair in the corner of the yard, refusing food, refusing to engage with anyone. My siblings showed up too. My brother brought his wife and kids, all smiles and loud voices. My sister came with her latest boyfriend, some guy none of us had met before. They gravitated toward my father, sat near him, probably because they felt obligated. That's when things went sideways. One of the other parents at the party, a friend of my wife's, came up to me and asked what I did for work. I'm a high school teacher. I teach history, and I love it. The pay isn't great, but I find the work meaningful. I told her this, and she seemed genuinely interested, asked me about my favorite parts of the job, about the kids I taught. My father overheard. I saw him turn his head, saw the way his jaw tightened. He'd always hated that I became a teacher. When I told him I was going into education instead of business or law or something that made real money, he'd looked at me like I was throwing my life away. He'd wanted me to be a lawyer like him, to take over his practice when he retired. Instead, I chose a career that actually made me happy, and he never forgave me for it. The conversation with the other parent wrapped up, and I moved on to check on the kids. That's when I heard my father's voice, louder than it needed to be, cutting through the background noise of the party. He was talking to my brother and sister, but he was making sure everyone could hear. He was saying how disappointed he was in me, how I'd wasted my potential, how I'd chosen a dead-end career that would never amount to anything. I stopped what I was doing. Other parents had stopped talking too. Kids were still playing, oblivious, but the adults were listening now. My wife was frozen near the food table, a plate of cake in her hands. Then my father looked directly at me and said it. He said I was a disgrace. He said I embarrassed him. He said that every time someone asked him what his son did for a living, he had to admit I was just a teacher, and it made him ashamed. He said all of this in front of my wife, my kids, my friends, my neighbors. He said it on my daughter's birthday, in my own backyard, at a party I was hosting. The yard went quiet. Even the kids seemed to sense something had shifted, their voices dropping to whispers. My brother and sister looked uncomfortable, but didn't say anything. They never did. My wife's face had gone pale, and she was staring at my father with an expression I'd never seen before, something between fury and disbelief. I felt this cold, heavy weight settle in my chest. 3 years of bank statements flashed through my mind. 3 years of emergency calls, of dropped plans, of telling my own kids we couldn't afford things because Grandpa needed his medication. 3 years of watching my wife budget and save and sacrifice so we could keep my father afloat. And this was what I got in return. Public humiliation at my daughter's birthday party. I walked into the house without saying a word. My wife followed me, asking what I was doing, but I didn't answer. I went straight to my home office, opened my filing cabinet, and pulled out a folder. I'd kept every receipt, every bill, every bank statement related to my father's care. I'm organized like that. Always have been. I'd never intended to use them as leverage, but I'd kept them anyway, some small part of me knowing that maybe someday I'd need proof of what I'd done. I carried the folder back outside. The party had fractured into awkward clusters of conversation, people trying to pretend they hadn't just witnessed what they'd witnessed. My daughter was sitting on my wife's lap, looking confused and worried. I walked straight to my father. I opened the folder and started pulling out papers. Receipts for insulin, bills from the cardiologist, the endocrinologist, the podiatrist, grocery receipts from the special diabetic food, receipts for the home health aide I'd hired to check on him twice a week. I laid them all on the small table next to his chair, one by one, a paper trail of 3 years of financial support. My father looked at the growing pile with something like confusion, then irritation. He asked what I was doing, his voice still carrying that edge of authority he'd always wielded over me. I didn't answer right away. I kept pulling out papers, kept stacking them, until the folder was empty and the table was covered. Then I told him he could have them all. I told him every bill, every expense, every dollar I'd spent was right there in front of him, and from now on, they were his problem. I told him I was done. Done being his safety net, done being his punching bag, done sacrificing my family's financial security for a man who couldn't even show basic respect. He started to sputter something about ingratitude, about how he'd raised me, about how I owed him. I cut him off. I told him he was right, that I was a disgrace, and since I was such an embarrassment, he wouldn't have to worry about being associated with me anymore. I told him not to call me for rides to appointments, for help with bills, for anything. I told him to ask my brother or sister, the ones who apparently hadn't wasted their potential. My brother stood up then, started to say something about calming down, about not making rash decisions. I looked at him and asked when the last time was that he'd paid for any of our father's care. He went quiet. I turned to my sister and asked her the same question. She looked away. My father tried to stand, probably to leave with some dramatic exit, but he wobbled and sat back down heavily. For a moment, I felt that old instinct to help him, to make sure he was okay. But then I remembered what he'd just said, how he'd humiliated me in front of everyone I cared about, and the instinct died. I told the remaining guests I was sorry, that the party was over. Most of them understood, gathered their kids quickly, offered sympathetic looks to my wife as they left. My wife ushered our daughter inside, away from the scene. My brother and sister helped my father to his car. None of them looked at me. My father was still trying to argue, still insisting I was overreacting, that I was being selfish. I stood there and watched them leave, and when his car pulled out of my driveway, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Relief. Update 1. The first week after the party was strange. My phone stayed silent. No calls from my father asking for rides or money. No guilt-tripping messages from my siblings. My wife and I had a long conversation that night after we'd put our daughter to bed. She told me she was proud of me, that I'd done the right thing, that she'd been waiting for me to stand up to him for years. She also admitted that she'd been terrified I never would, that we'd drain our savings and retirement trying to keep my father comfortable while our own kids suffered. We looked at our finances together, really looked at them for the first time in years. The numbers were worse than I'd realized. We'd been spending almost $1,500 a month on my father. $1,500 that could have gone into college funds, into home repairs, into the vacation we kept postponing. My wife didn't say I told you so, but she didn't have to. My daughter asked about Grandpa a few times. She wanted to know why he'd said those mean things, why everyone had left so suddenly. I tried to explain in terms a 7-year-old could understand, told her that sometimes grown-ups disagree and need space. She seemed to accept that, but I could tell she was confused. She'd never seen me angry like that before. On day 8, my brother called. He was angry, told me I'd put him in an impossible position. Apparently, my father had called him immediately after leaving my house, demanding that my brother take over the financial support. My brother had tried to deflect, said he couldn't afford it, but my father had been relentless. My brother wanted to know if I was really serious about cutting our father off, if I understood what that meant. I told him I was completely serious. I told him that our father had made his choice when he decided to humiliate me publicly, and now he had to live with the consequences. My brother called me selfish, said I was punishing an old sick man over hurt feelings. I reminded him about the folder of receipts, asked him if he wanted to know the exact total I'd spent over 3 years. He hung up on me. My sister texted the next day. Her message was gentler than my brother's call, but the intent was the same. She said our father was struggling, that his medications were expensive, that he needed help. She said we needed to be the bigger person, that family was supposed to forgive. I didn't respond. 2 weeks after the party, my father showed up at my school. I was between classes, standing in the hallway outside my classroom, when I saw him shuffling down the corridor. He looked older than I remembered, more frail. Some of my students noticed him, asked if I needed help. I told them everything was fine and led my father to an empty classroom. He tried a different approach this time. No yelling, no insults. He told me he was sorry, that he'd been out of line, that he'd said things he didn't mean. He told me he needed me, that he couldn't afford his medications without help, that the bills were piling up. He asked if we could work something out, if maybe I could just help with the essentials. I listened to all of it. Then I asked him if he remembered what he'd said at the party. He waved it off, said he'd already apologized, that I needed to move past it. I asked him if he actually thought I was a disgrace or if he just said it to hurt me. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I had my answer. I told him no. I told him I'd given him 3 years of financial support, emotional labor, and time away from my own family, and he'd repaid me with public humiliation. I told him I was teaching my daughter an important lesson about self-respect and boundaries, and that meant not letting people treat you like garbage just because they're family. He got angry again then, the facade dropping. He said I was just like my mother, vindictive and unforgiving. My mother had left him when I was 16, something he'd never let me forget. He said I'd regret this, that I'd feel guilty when something happened to him. I told him that was a risk I was willing to take and asked him to leave. He did, eventually, but not before causing a scene in the hallway that had the vice principal coming to check on me. I had to explain the situation, felt my professional and personal life colliding in the most uncomfortable way possible. My father had managed to embarrass me at work now too, proving that his behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern. Update 2. A month passed. My father stopped trying to contact me directly, but the pressure from my siblings intensified. My brother called every few days with updates about our father's declining health, his inability to afford medications, his depression. Each call was designed to make me feel guilty, to paint me as the villain in this story. My sister sent long text messages about family obligation and forgiveness, about how our father had done his best raising us, about how we had to be better than our pain. I blocked them both eventually. My wife supported the decision, said they were trying to manipulate me, that if they were so concerned, they could step up themselves. She was right, of course. Neither of them had offered to contribute financially. They just wanted me to go back to being the family's ATM so they didn't have to deal with the burden. Then my father had a health scare. My brother managed to get through on my wife's phone, Told her our father had been hospitalized with a severe hypoglycemic episode. He'd passed out at home, and a neighbor had found him. The doctors said he hadn't been taking his insulin properly, probably rationing it because he couldn't afford the full prescription. My wife told me about the call with this careful neutrality, making it clear she'd support whatever I decided. Part of me wanted to cave, to rush to the hospital, to fix everything like I always had. But I thought about my daughter's birthday party, about standing in my backyard surrounded by people I cared about while my father called me a disgrace. I thought about 3 years of receipts and zero gratitude. I stayed home. My father recovered. My brother called again, furious, telling me I was heartless, that I'd nearly let our father die. I told him that our father's health management was his own responsibility, that I'd spent 3 years making sure he had everything he needed and it hadn't mattered. I told him if he was so worried, he could drive the 2 hours and help out himself. 2 months after the party, something interesting happened. My brother called, but this time his tone was different. Defeated, maybe. He told me he'd been trying to help our father financially, that it was destroying his own budget, that his wife was threatening to leave if he didn't stop. He asked how I'd managed it for so long. I told him I'd managed it by sacrificing my family's financial security, by taking on extra tutoring jobs, by telling my kids no to things they wanted so their grandfather could have what he needed. I told him I'd managed it until I couldn't anymore, until the emotional cost exceeded what I was willing to pay. He was quiet for a long time. Then he admitted he'd never realized how much I'd been covering, that he'd assumed I was exaggerating. He said my sister had tried to help too, but gave up after 1 month. He said our father was impossible, demanding, and ungrateful, and he finally understood why I'd walked away. I didn't feel vindicated by his admission. I felt tired. I told him I was sorry he was going through it, but that I wasn't coming back. I told him he needed to make his own choice about what he was willing to sacrifice, but that he shouldn't expect me to feel guilty about protecting my family. 3 months after the party, my father called from my sister's phone. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice was different, smaller somehow. He told me he'd been wrong. He told me he'd taken me for granted, that he'd been cruel, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. I listened. Then I asked him if he actually believed I was a disgrace, or if he was just sorry he couldn't use me anymore. The question hung there between us, heavy and unavoidable. He cried. I'd never heard my father cry before. He told me he'd been bitter about his own life, about the career he'd lost when his health declined, about the respect he'd once commanded that had disappeared. He told me he'd been jealous that I seemed happy, that I'd chosen passion over prestige and somehow made it work. He told me he'd wanted to hurt me because he was hurting, and that was unforgivable. It was the most honest he'd ever been with me. It didn't erase what he'd done, but it explained it. I told him I appreciated his honesty, that I believed he was sorry, but that sorry didn't fix everything. I told him trust was built over time, and he'd demolished years of it in one afternoon. He asked what he could do to make it right. I told him that was his problem to figure out, not mine. I told him I wasn't ready to let him back into my life, that maybe someday I would be, but not now. I told him to work on himself, to get therapy, to find a way to be less bitter and angry. Then I hung up. Update 3. 6 months after the party, things had settled into a new normal. My father and I had no contact. My siblings had given up trying to guilt me into reconciliation. My family's finances had improved dramatically, and my wife and I had managed to put away a decent amount into savings for the first time in years. Then I got a letter in the mail. It was from my father, handwritten, several pages long. In it, he detailed everything he'd done wrong, every moment he'd taken me for granted, every time he'd prioritized his ego over my well-being. He told me about the therapy he'd started, about the depression and bitterness he'd been carrying since his retirement. He told me about the perspective he'd gained from having to manage everything himself, from realizing how much I'd been carrying. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He didn't ask for money or help. He just wanted me to know that he understood now, that he saw clearly what he'd done, and that he was sorry. He said he hoped someday I might be willing to talk again, but that he respected whatever boundary I needed to set. I showed the letter to my wife. She read it carefully and then asked what I wanted to do. I didn't know. The anger had faded over the months, replaced by something more complicated. I didn't miss the financial burden or the emotional manipulation, but I did miss having a father, or at least the idea of one. I wrote back. I told him I'd received his letter, that I appreciated his honesty, but that rebuilding trust would take time. I told him I wasn't ready for regular contact, but that maybe we could start with occasional updates, no expectations, no demands. I told him I needed to protect my family first, always, and that any relationship we had going forward would have to respect that boundary. He wrote back agreeing to my terms. Over the next few months, we exchanged a few letters. He told me about his therapy sessions, about the changes he was making in his life. He'd started attending a support group for people with chronic illnesses, had made some friends, had found ways to occupy his time that didn't involve making other people miserable. I told him about my daughter's school play, about the promotion my wife had gotten at work, about the trip we were planning for next summer. I kept the details surface level, protective of my peace, but it felt less hostile than silence. We still haven't seen each other in person. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. But the letters continue, and they're honest in a way our relationship never was before. My father doesn't get to be part of my daily life anymore, doesn't get to make demands or expectations. He gets what I'm willing to give, and for now, that's just words on paper. My brother asked me recently if I felt like I'd won. It was a strange question. I told him I hadn't been trying to win anything. I'd been trying to survive, to protect my family, to maintain some shred of self-respect. I told him that walking away from my father was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the healthiest. Sometimes I still think about that moment at the party, standing in my backyard with my father's words echoing in my ears, making the decision to be done. Part of me wishes I'd handled it differently, more privately maybe, not in front of my daughter and her friends. But another part of me knows that public humiliation required a public response, that years of private suffering had earned me the right to one moment of defiance. I'm teaching my daughter about boundaries now, about the difference between love and obligation. I'm teaching her that family doesn't get unlimited chances to hurt you. That respect has to flow both ways. She's young, but she's watching, learning what it means to stand up for yourself even when it's hard. My father is managing. My siblings help him sometimes now, though not with the same dedication I once showed. He's learned to budget, to ask for help from social services, to accept the limitations of his situation. He's learning, slowly, that people aren't infinite resources to be drained. And me? I'm learning to live without guilt. Learning that loving someone doesn't mean destroying yourself to help them. Learning that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is walk away.